Okay, so we are all good to go. So, hello everybody. Thanks for everyone who joins in and watches us. Want to introduce you all to Charity Norman. So, thanks, Charity, for joining us.
Thank you
So,
for having me.
Charity's a best-selling author of 6 novels, including BBC Radio 2, Richard and Judy, and World Book Night titles. A Nio Marsh Awards finalist and UK Reading Agency Book of the Year. Her latest, The Secrets of Strangers, which I've started reading. I'm about a third of the way reading it, and yeah, it's really, really drawn me in.
Great. Good to
It's,
hear.
yeah, a really gripping book, and can't wait to see what happens. Her, so sorry, where am I up to now? I lost my train of thought. So this was released in 2020, and her books have been translated into various languages. Charity was born in Uganda, grew up in England, and met her future husband, a New Zealander, under a Bedford truck in the Sahara Desert. So that all sounds very interesting. Um, and for 15 years, she practiced as a criminal and family barrister and mediator in the northeast of England. But in 2002, she took a break from the courts and moved with her family to New Zealand, where she began to ride. She has 3 almost grown children and too many cats, and divides her time between Wellington and Royal Hawke's Bay. And she loves hearing from readers. So thanks so much, Charity, for joining us. It sounds like you've had an interesting life. Um, is there anything else you'd like to tell us about yourself, or maybe your latest book?
Oh, well, I think as for an interesting life, I think everybody's got a story, haven't they?
Mm,
So it's that,
yeah.
if you take long enough to hear it. My latest book, well, actually, funny you ask that, because I sent my next book off to my publisher a few weeks ago, and I'm expecting to hear back any day, literally, like by about the end of May, start of June. And then over the next few weeks, I'll be doing the rewriting, structural editing, and that should
Mm.
be out in the first part of next year.
And what are you able to tell us about it?
Well, not too much. It's set. Some of my books have been set in New Zealand, some in England.
Mm.
There's a brief glimpse of East Africa in one of them, and this next one is set in New Zealand. In fact, it's set in Hawke's Bay, where I am right now at this moment, in this funny little wooden cabin, and it's set under the Ruahine Mountains, which some people will know who live here. And it's about a woman who is living in England. She comes back to Hawke's Bay to look after her father, who has Alzheimer's, and as his mind begins to melt, she begins to wonder whether he is at all who she thought he was. I
Okay.
can't really tell you any more than that, without
So
spoilers.
a bit of mystery and
Bit of mystery, yes, bit of mystery, bit of missing persons, and a whole lot of what I hope will be unexpected.
we've got a lot of people watching already, which is really, really great. Some have said they're watching from New Zealand as well.
Oh, yes. Hello, fellow New Zealanders.
So, the people watching, if you've got any questions for Charity, please remember to type them in comments and I'll read them out. One of the questions I have is from Mary. She says, where do you get your inspiration for your books? And I just wanted to say something about The Secrets of Strangers. From what I've read so far, because I haven't read too much of it yet, it reminded me a lot of Lint Cafe.
Yes, yes, I can understand that.
Mm,
It wasn't intended. So, The
mm,
Secret of Strangers, for anybody who hasn't read it or begun to read it, is set in a cafe in South London, Balham. And one morning, everybody's going there. They're going to get their coffee or have breakfast with their grandson or whatever. And the cafe's crowded, and suddenly a gunman bursts in, shoots the cafe's owner, and a hostage situation begins, and they're under siege. And so the rest of the book is about what happens next, really, in the lives of these characters that become
mm.
really entwined, and that of the hostage negotiator who's outside trying to make contact with the gunman. But it's a lot sort of more complex than it sounds. And when I wrote that, I was aware of the Lint Cafe siege, and I did spend a lot of time reading the inquest from the Lint Cafe siege as part of my research, so that into understanding some of the aspects of the siege and how it might be handled. But it was actually, to answer Mary's question, it was actually a different siege which gave me the idea, and that was in 2009. I was living in a little city called Napier, which you know, which is on the east coast of the North Island of New Zealand. It's a very quiet, sedate city, rather lovely Art Deco, and the beautiful Art Deco festivals held there every year, and nothing ever happens there until until one day we actually were living there, and I was sitting with our 3 children, and we had a house on a street called Chaucer Road, and it's a very steep hill opposite the cemetery, and right next to us, our next door neighbour was a man called Jan Molinar, and we knew him a bit. My husband used to chat to him over the fence when he was at the house, and one morning a tragedy occurred because a police officer, Constable Snee, went to visit Jan Molinar, and to cut a really long story short, Jan took one of his arsenal of rifles, shot the constable dead, and a siege, and wounded another officer. I had just driven up down the road with my children, and a siege began, and we all heard the shots.
And this was your neighbour, did you say?
Yes, with our neighbour, who actually was the gunman. And our house was taken over by the Armed Defenders Squad. And so when we finally got it back days later, we had to plug dozens of bullet holes in the walls and the windows.
Wow.
And so the whole of what was sort of interesting was the whole city held its breath, really. The people flew in, or all kinds of drama with helicopters flying in and armed vehicles and people with guns everywhere. And the area was cordoned off, people having to sneak in to feed their animals. And you could hear all these shots from where we were. And then there was one single shot, and that was sort of the final one. And Jan Molinar took his own life. And I remember before that happened, I remember thinking, it's awful, what he did was appalling and unforgivable. But I remember thinking he must be really tired by now, because days had passed and he's all alone, and how is it feeling? So years later, I was explaining to a friend, I was telling a friend this story about the Napier siege, which is quite an unusual thing to be involved in. And we were sitting in a cafe, and I was telling her this story. And I suddenly looked around the cafe, and it occurred to me that I didn't know anything about any of the people that were sitting around us. And I didn't know what struggles they were facing, what journeys they were walking, and that any one of them could be under that kind of huge pressure, could be about to blow. And so then I thought, there's got to be a book in that. And that was where I got the idea.
That's very interesting, and it must have been a traumatic thing for you. I don't actually, what year did you say it happened?
2009.
Okay, I actually don't remember hearing about it, but that was the year I moved to Australia, so maybe.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think I think it was in the early part. I want to say May, but have a Google anyway.
Yeah.
Napier,
I'll have to have a look.
Napier siege. Can't miss it. Napier shooting.
And you practiced as a criminal barrister. How much of your work have you been able to get inspiration for stories from?
Quite a lot.
Yeah.
Quite a lot. I mean, it's inspiration for stories, but it's more than that. It's being with people in the crises, times of crisis, the worst times of their life, or the most difficult times, and they're under so much pressure. I mean, it makes me sound like a horrible sort of, as if I use other people's pain for my writing, which I suppose is true, but it's of course I wasn't intending to be a writer when I was a barrister. But you look back and you sort of remember how people react to things, and what the sort of speech patterns they use, and also some of the stories. For example, my second book, The Son-in-Law, is about a man who hits his wife, and as she goes down, she hits her head on the mantelpiece and she's killed. And the book is about his after he's come out of prison, and whether or not there is redemption for him, and whether he can be a father to his 3 children who witnessed the death of their mother. And this idea became because years ago I was in a case and I was acting for the children, and their father, who had murdered their mother, was applying to have contact with them. He was in prison for life. He was actually a sociopathic, narcissist who killed her in cold blood. So the case was completely different. It's not, I never use the case as it is, it's always completely different, but it was sitting in court that day, and the hair stood up on the back of our necks as this man was brought in at the back. He's quite an evil character. And I was sitting there and thinking, at what stage does a man lose the right, or what stage do children lose the right to know who their parent is? And that got me thinking. So that kind of thing, it just sows a seed, and years later, you bring it out.
Yeah. So I was wondering how you decide which country of the many that you can call home to set your novel in.
Yeah, that's tricky. That's a really good question. Often it sort of answers itself. When you're thinking about what to write next, it becomes obvious. If I'm writing something with a lot of court in it, such as my first book, Freeing Grace, or The Son-in-Law, the third one, then it's quite helpful to set it in England because I understand the English legal system better, and obviously, therefore it's a little bit less risky for me to do it that way. But some of them have obviously lent themselves to the landscapes of New Zealand. And the second one, she's called Second Chances here. It's called After the Fall in England, in the United Kingdom. And the more recent one, See You in September, which is about a cult. And this cult is in a really isolated place on Lake Tarawera. I don't know if you've been in the Rotorua Lakes, which is a beautiful place. What really marks out Lake Tarawera is that it's dominated by this volcano, and in the 1850s the volcano blew its top and hundreds of people were killed, and the sky turned black with the debris flying, sort of tons and tons of ash, and people looking up at the stars saw the stars go out and they thought it was the end of the world, and to them, many of them, it was the end of the world. And so there's an obvious place to set a doomsday cult. So that really, it kind of was pretty obvious where I was going to set that. It wouldn't be so good in Balam, I don't think.
And could you tell us a little bit about how you became a writer? Was it something you always thought you were going to do?
Yeah, pretty much, yes. Although I gave up on it for decades. But when I was a child, I read a lot. We lived in, I was born in Uganda, but we lived in Yorkshire, and that was idyllic and lovely. And we weren't so far from Bronte country, where the Bronte sisters lived and grew up. And my parents used to take me sometimes to Haworth to see Wuthering Heights and the parsonage where they lived. And I sort of thought I was Emily Bronte, and I used to write terrible poetry and sort of pick harebells and dance about on the moors. And then we moved to Birmingham, inner city Birmingham. That was a completely different, and there was no countryside, and there was hardly even a blade of grass. And when we hung the washing up, it would all turn black with soot. And I was quite unhappy, I think, initially, and quite lonely, and didn't like school. I hated school. I really loathed school. And so to get myself up in the morning as a sort of 9-year-old, 10-year-old, I used to read a page of a book, and then I would put on one garment, and then another page, and I'd put on another garment. I was always late for school. But that was the only way. That was my method of getting myself out of bed. And again and again, my poor father had to drive me to the number 5 bus because I'd missed the normal bus. So reading was really important, and I always wanted to be a writer. I wanted to write like they did. I wanted to be able to create stories like Richard Adams and Watership Down, or those wonderful stories that had given me so much joy and pleasure, and a place to hide in the library at lunchtime. So I really did. But then as I grew older, and you start to sort of be more realistic, and people say, oh, you can't be a writer, there's no money in it, and you've got to do something sensible that you can, proper career. And so I went into the law, which actually was really great. I really enjoyed it. But it wasn't until about, I've been practicing for about 15 years, and I'd met my husband, and we had these 3 really small children. They were born, all of them, within about 3 and a bit years. So, you know, nothing in moderation. And Tim was a house husband, and we're living in North Yorkshire, where there aren't many house husbands in North Yorkshire. And I would go off to work every day, and I'm driving all over the northeast, and I'd go and be in court all day, and I'd go and collect the brief for the next day, and I'd come back and I'd read to my tiny children, and then go and read a brief about, you know, maybe a sexual assault on a tiny child, and stay up really late, and then leave really early the next morning. And so I hardly ever saw them, and they used to wait for me at the gate, the children, and I'd come home, and their fingers would be really cold from waiting for me. I felt so guilty. I mean, that's our lot in life, isn't it, to feel guilty? And I felt so guilty, and eventually one day we talked about it, and we thought, well, maybe we should have a role reversal. I thought that I would try and bring up my own children, you know, like get home a bit more. I didn't really know what that meant or what involved, and I had no idea how to do it. You know, I was chaotic, but and having made that decision that I would take a break from the law. Tim's a New Zealander. The New Zealand dollar in those days was, you know, not so strong to the pound, and also it is such a stunningly beautiful, lovely country. So it was kind of a no-brainer, really, to cut and paste ourselves from the northeast of England to Central Hawke's Bay.
Yeah. Nice, thanks for sharing.
And having done that, then I started writing.
Yeah.
Then I had the time.
So was that your plan when you moved to New Zealand, that's what you were going to do?
It was the plan. Yeah. Yes, that was part of it. So, well, Tim will go to work. I will try to be at home with the children, but also this is an opportunity to sort of live this dream that I'd always had, but had put on the back burner.
Yeah. So when you decided that, how hard or easy was it to get that first book published?
If I'd had this smidgen of an idea how hard it was going to be, I don't know if I would have got started. That's probably a good thing. We don't know what's ahead, isn't it? So the very first book is still in a drawer, and it's never really seen the light of day. And I think that's really common, that, you know, authors will often write a first book it's kind of a sighting shot, you know. And I cannibalize it. I've taken bits out of it. But the first book was published, Free in Grace, took years to write, because I didn't know what I was doing. And I know I've heard other authors, I think last week you had an author who said that, and I was like, yeah, I know what you mean. Didn't know what I was doing. I didn't have a structure. I didn't have a synopsis. I kept, and what happens is you start to write, and you go down this alleyway, and it's a blind alleyway, and you realize that you've got to cut all of that and come back and start again, and then you've got the jigsaw pieces won't fit together, and you have to rewrite it. So it just took a lot longer. I actually think it didn't make it a worse book, but it just took a lot longer, and you can end up having to rewrite it again and again to get that evenness of tone. And I reckon that for every sentence of Free in Grace, there's 50 ghosts, you know, 50 previous iterations of it that I then rewrote. Took years. And then I got an agent. That was so exciting. Oh my goodness, I've got an agent. You think you're there, and you're not. You're so not. Then there's the rewriting process, and then, you know, publish, and then you rewrite it again. So it's a long process, but you are learning. Well, I was. Maybe other people don't need to learn, but I was learning all that time. It was actually really useful. I don't regret any of it, but it took many years to get the first book published. After that, it's much quicker.
And did you do any formal sort of training or anything, or courses for it? Well, no. You just learnt from your own mistakes and
yeah, that's right. Just piled in. Yeah, like with everything else I do. I went on a weekend when I got really bored. I went on a weekend travel writing course in Napier, run by a New Zealand writer, and I said to him, should I go on a course or something? He said, no, you can write, just go away and write. That was really good advice.
Yeah. That's good. Going back to the secrets of strangers, Geraldine has a question. She says that she was very interested in the negotiator's role in the negotiation process in the siege and was wondering what research you did for this.
That's really interesting. Well,
Mm.
I think one thing that helped is I've done quite a lot of telephone counselling, Lifeline and Samaritans listening. And so I've been in that situation where you're in a room and you're talking to somebody, you've just got the voice, that's all you've got. So there's no body language at all. And that the training for that and doing that for some years was certainly helped with understanding how somebody sounds when they're in real crisis. But apart from that, I read books by negotiators, including the negotiator in the Napier Siege, in fact, who wrote about a really good book about his experiences as a police negotiator. And I went online, I found things like a lecture by a police negotiator describing their job in great detail, and endless videos and books and articles and conversations. So it took a while, but by the end, I think, I'm sure a real police negotiator would say, no, it was rubbish. But I did feel I had done my very best to get to the bottom of it.
Yeah. And with all the research you've done for your books, could you tell us what's the most surprising thing you've ever come across?
Oh, wow, in researching. I think researching, there's a lot of things actually, because I researched a lot of things. I'm half expecting the SAS to swing through the window every time I look up how to blow up a boat or something. Yeah. I think probably the standout for me is probably when I was researching cults or new religions for See You in September. And I had not appreciated how many cults there are. Oh, don't worry, I've got to. How many cults there are out there?
Yeah.
And how many people there are who think in the world today who think they are Jesus Christ reincarnated.
Okay.
And I was astounded, like there are hundreds of them, and this really, and of course with YouTube you can go online and you can watch them. So I spent ages watching people like there's an Australian AJ Miller, for example, and an English one, and there's a guy in Russia who I think's now been arrested, whose name I think is Vissarion, who had hundreds of thousands of followers, all of whom would do anything for them. And I found this genuinely stunning, actually, just how many of these extraordinarily charismatic people with unusual perceptions of themselves there are. Putting it very, very neutrally.
Yeah. And did some of them have quite large followings?
Huge.
Oh, really?
I mean, the guy in Russia, for example, who was a traffic policeman until he was 30, a traffic cop. And he was living on top of a mountain, and he would come out from time to time wearing his, flowing robes, and he had a beard, and you can imagine. And of course, they've always got women living with them. But he would, I think he had several thousand followers, and there was a Red Army colonel and a ballet dancer and doctors and engineers who come from all over Europe, who were scraping out. They had to be vegetarian. They had to live in the Russian steppe, this freezing cold place. With no electricity, and they were sort of scraping out a miserable existence living off the earth. And every few hours the bell would toll, and they would all have to stop and sort of face the I think it was to face the picture of the guy on their wall. Okay. And there were a lot of them, thousands of them. Just in a way they were living an idyllic existence, in that it was sort of very pure, which I tried to kind of paint in the book, See You in September.
That's interesting. Mary says, do you have writer peers who you support in each other?
No, you don't? I don't, no. no, I just don't. No, nobody sees what I'm writing while I'm writing
And
at
you don't
all.
have no friends or anything, you just write it and then send it
Yeah.
off to the editor. Okay. That's quite, yeah, I'd have to
Yeah.
say that's quite unusual from other authors that we've
Oh,
spoken to.
really?
Yeah,
That's interesting.
yeah.
Um,
Most have
no,
friends or other authors that they're showing as they're going along.
character as they go. No,
Hmm.
well, that's really just easy. I have heard the odd author say that, and the odd author has said, would I do that with them? Um, I think that as soon as somebody else reads it, the life of the story changes. While it's only in my head, then it's mine. Characters are alive in my head.
Mm,
They're taking on their. I become a bit weird, and I begin to live through them in some way. And as soon as somebody else sees it, that changes that dynamic. So I prefer that not to be
yeah,
until
yeah, okay.
write it,
Mm,
and then the editor comes a
yeah,
different editor
makes the,
coming in.
yeah. No,
But no,
that's
even if my husband comes in, I'm like slamming the laptop down, go, oh, no, look. So definitely not.
Yeah, okay. Zoe's saying, without giving away too much, did you know how The Secrets of Strangers was going to end when you started?
Well, no, I didn't. In fact, I thought I did, but I had a different ending. I
Mm,
think. Um, and in the synopsis, the original synopsis I wrote, it had a different ending. And I wrote the whole book, and I got towards the end. And of course, as you've written it, you've lived with these characters for at least a year, and they've become really real to you, more real than
mm,
the people around you in many respects. And you've lived in their heads, and you've tried to find out who they are. And it began to dawn on me that what I had thought was going to happen wasn't going to happen,
yeah.
couldn't happen, wouldn't happen, isn't right for that
Mm.
story. And but then I was worried about the other alternative, which it's hard to say without a spoiler, because
Mm.
that was pretty awful. So I went back and rewrote the whole book again,
Oh,
reread
really? Wow.
it, just went right through it again
Mm.
without making the decision. And when I got to the end that time, I was sure that the different ending was
Was
the
better.
right one. That was the
Yeah.
ending. That was the only ending I thought. I know some
Mm.
people found it not what they wanted, but most people, most of the feedback I've had is that it was, although it wasn't what they wanted, it was what they felt was right.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Zoe, who asked that question, said that she thought the ending was perfect.
Oh, thank you, Zoe. That's very nice of you.
And is that normal in other books you've written that you've had a different ending at the end than what you thought, or?
Most of them have been. That was the most dramatic, really, in terms of changing the ending.
Mm,
Thinking back now, I mean, sometimes there will be the detail of the end might be different. In After the Fall, Second Chances, for example, I wasn't absolutely sure, and when I got to the end, it was obvious. But
mm,
nowadays, I try to have as much as I can. I try to know where I'm going, because it's really that writing the ending is quite a difficult for me anyway. May not be for other authors. Writing the ending is quite a difficult part of writing. It's quite there are peaks and troughs with writing a book. Around 50 or 60,000 words, it's like wading through treacle, and you start to think, oh, this is bilge, this is pants, nobody's going to read it, they're all going to see I'm
yeah.
hopeless. And then you get going again, and then somewhere towards the end, it can start to feel like, you're climbing a mountain, there's always another bit. And it really helps if you know where you're going. I found
Mm,
that
mm,
really helps. So I
yeah.
try to know where I'm going if I can.
Mm. And sorry, Adrian, she says, do your characters ever take over?
Mm. Well, the answer is, Adrienne, not really. I once heard Val McDermid being asked this question, and she said something like, "Well, I control my characters. If they were real people, I get them to put the wash on and do their household chores." They sometimes don't behave as with the ending of The Secrets of Strangers. They sometimes you find that they wouldn't do exactly what you had planned for them. But as a general rule, I have created them, and so I although I get to know them better and they become more rounded and more real, and I discover all kinds of hidden depths in them, generally speaking, they do what I intended them to do. And if I find they're going too far off track, then I have to think, is that what I want? Or do I want to come back and actually look at where this character needs to go for the narrative of the story, which is, it's important. So although people say, well, it's character driven, it is, but there has to be some control over your characters.
Yeah.
You end up all over the place.
Geraldine says, does writing some of your characters have an effect on you emotionally? She said that her heart just broke for Sam in The Secrets of Strangers, and she wondered how hard it was for you to write his story.
Oh, that's amazing. That was Geraldine, did you say?
Yeah.
Yeah. Geraldine, that is such a good question. And yes, it did. Yes, that was tough. Yes, it was. I at the time I had somebody I knew very well who was really struggling with, about whether to carry on living or not. And so it was quite a real thing at that time, and a friend. And so I was really immersed in Sam's story. I've got sons myself, and and I've known people who got themselves into awful trouble. And so yes, I was really involved in that, and that does happen a lot, especially towards the end of the process of writing a book. I find I tend to isolate myself in an isolated place, whether it be a cottage in the middle of nowhere, or on one occasion a monastery, places where I'm not interrupted, and do a whole rewrite through. And at that stage, I actually begin to often dream about the characters, and they become very real. And doing that with Sam was tricky, and I think I did go a little bit funny, and it can affect your mood, undoubtedly, because you're trying to live in the head of somebody who's suicidally, depressed, and then you're expected to find somebody's socks in real life, or feed the cat. Well, actually, feeding the cat's not difficult, because I love my cat. You get the general gist.
Yeah. Could you tell us what you like reading yourself, and if maybe there is something you've read lately you'd like to recommend to us?
Oh, such a long list. It's tricky. It's just wonderful books out there, aren't there?
They sure are.
There sure are. I've Claire McIntosh's "I Let You Go." I'm sure most people have already read that, but something that stood out for me. And at the moment, I'm entranced. I tend to read more than one book at once, so I'm sort of really astounded by how impressed I am by Kelly Rimmer's book, Truths I Never Told You. It's brilliant, and I'm finding that sort of really compelling. Hamnet is the other one I'm in the middle of at the moment. I tend to have one that I'm listening to and one that I'm reading. I have just read a book by Rose Carlyle, a New Zealand author, The Girl in the Mirror. And that is a rollicking good read. It really is. It's a thriller. I don't know if you've come across it. Rose Carlyle, it's her debut novel. She wrote this thriller about twins who are not what they seem, and it's got sailing, it's got murderous intentions, it's got beautiful blonde twins, it's got everything, and it's a really good story. And so I read it because I was partly because it's a great book, but also I was going to meet Rose Carlyle for a book festival, so I highly recommend that. And I'm really fond of non-fiction as well. So I just read last year, actually, a book by Richard, if anyone's into non-fiction, a book by a pathologist called Richard Shepherd was my standout book for last year. I can't remember actually the name of it, but Richard Shepherd, Pathology, and you'll find it. And also I've got one that I'm reading, I've sort of been dipping into, right in front of me, Sapiens. Anyone's got, it's a non-fiction. I mean, it's this one I tend to do a bit more and then go and read something else and come back and read a bit more, because it's really fascinating and really takes a bit to get through. Yeah. There's a longer list than that for sure, but we'll stop there.
Yeah. No, thanks for those recommendations. Could you tell us, for you, what does a good story mean, or what makes a good story?
Um, I think for me, the best writing doesn't trip over itself. It's not so pleased with itself. It's not so focused on the vocabulary of the words that it obscures the story. So the good story is one where the characters seem real, where their thought processes are something I can relate to or understand, or even if I can't relate to it, it's something where I can see where they're coming. Even though it's a psychopath, I can where it's properly explored, and where there is real tension, and but where there isn't where it's moving onwards. So the writing of somebody like Daphne du Maurier, for example, who's there's a mystery, there's decent writing, but it's not so caught up in the writing that there's no story. Yeah. I'd say. So a rollicking good story and some great characters.
Yeah. And if you were to give a budding writer one tip, what would that be?
Edit, I guess. And one, if I had three, it would be more. But one tip alone is edit. Take advice, ask for advice from a manuscript assessor, or if you're lucky enough to get other professionals to help you. But just keep editing. Keep writing, of course, the first tip is write the thing.
Yeah.
But edit. That's my kind of obsession.
Yeah. And what do you like to do when you're not writing?
When's that? With writer's life, it's kind of never ends. There's always some more you've got to be doing. I sing in normally when I'm living in Hawke's Bay, I sing in two choirs. I sing in the Napier Cathedral Choir, which is the Waiapu Napier Cathedral Choir. It's a lovely choir with a really good director of music and just wonderful music, lovely music. I was there. I went back yesterday because the dean was retiring. I went back and sang with them. It's just really good for you to sing with a choir. And it's sight reading, and so that helps you to forget other things. It's a bit like mindfulness. And I also sing normally with a 10-voice choir called Octavius. So I do a lot of that. I like going for walks. I do a lot of thinking when I'm walking, and reading and staying in touch with my children more than they probably wish I would.
That sounds good. And we said before that you really like readers reaching out to you. Could you tell everyone watching how they can reach you or keep in touch with what's going on with you?
Well, it'd be I really do love hearing from readers, and I have lots of conversations with readers. And you can get hold of me on my author Facebook page, Charity Norman Author. And that's the best way, because I'm better at Facebook than Twitter or Instagram. But you can get hold of me on Twitter. It's Charity Norman 1. And I do have an Instagram, which is Charity Norman 1, but I have never posted anything, which is, I appreciate, pathetic. deeply sad and tragic. And I will. One of these days I shall post something, and you've all got to like it, or I'll be really upset.
And then we'll be all waiting for you to do your first post. Yeah.
Collective cheer. I did actually. I saw you posted about this today, Facebook Live on Instagram, and I got up my courage and shared it to my story, but I had no idea what that meant.
Oh, that's good. All right. Thanks so much for joining us. Been great chatting to you, and thanks for everyone who joined in. We had some really great questions. Thank you.
Really great questions. Thanks, everybody, and thank you so much.
No, thank you, and hope we have a chance to talk to you again.
Hope so. That would be lovely. See you again.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.